Hi, everyone. Nate here. Just a quick heads up that if you enjoy What a Hell of a Way to Die, you can access bonus content in which we publish a new episode every week on our Patreon. The link is in the show notes, and for $5 a month, you get access to all the bonus content we've put out since we started the show back in 2016. Hope you enjoy, and thanks for listening.
Glory, glory, what a hell of a way to die. Glory, glory, what a hell of a way to die. Glory, glory, what a hell of a way to die. He ain't gonna jump no more. Zoom.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of What a Hell of a Way to Die. You've got me, you've got Nate, and we have Cory Doctorow, author, tech guy, coming on to not only discuss the hell world that we live in, which is a frequent topic of discussion for the podcast, but the hell world as it relates to technology. Cory, how are you doing today?
I'm living in a hell world now. I'm okay. You know, all things being equal, could be worse. But I am anxious and for the moment still solvent and healthy. How about that?
Well, I did notice. I was checking your Twitter feed today, and I noticed you did a lot of posting of something that I'm really into as well, which is atomic age furniture. Weird time in between dropping bombs and then realizing that we shouldn't be putting radium on our lips as glow-in-the-dark lipstick. There was
radium's only for suppositories.
Exactly. There's a so it seemed like that's your happy place, is taking a look at Tumblr accounts of old advertising and atomic age stuff. So I'm 100% with you on that one.
It's my completely harmless hobby of subscribing to like Brutalism and atomic age furniture and ad art tumblers, and then just pasting them into Twitter as a way of just like paying. It makes you pay slightly more attention to them than you do when you're on the endless scroll. And it kind of then periodically, like, I'll bookmark one as a little like image board.
Yeah, it's like your own little brutalist Pinterest of some kind.
That's right.
So,
yeah.
Cory, we've got you on to talk about your latest book, Attack Surface, which is part of now. It's part of two other books, but is this a trilogy or is this just books that take place in the same universe?
So the first book, the first two books are the one is the sequel to the other, Little Brother and Homeland. They're young adult novels about kids who sort of seize the means of computation in times of like democratic distress. So the first one is set during an occupation by the DHS of San Francisco following a terrorist attack. And the second one is during a contested election that's disrupted by a huge drop of military and intelligence leaks. The third one is a standalone novel. Intended for adults. It doesn't have it's not like it's super violent or super sexual. It's like it's about people confronting the terrible compromises they made on the way to adulthood. So it's like just maybe more about the adult experience than the first two, but it stands on its own. Its main character is a minor character from the other two books, this woman Masha, who's at the beginning and the end of the other two books, and she's a surveillance contractor.
Yeah, and before we brought you on, I was just about to tell Nate that this speaks to, the both of us very much, because we also are, people who made a lot of compromises, and then you come to an inevitable conclusion. For us, it's the military and our service. We're like, wow, that I really probably shouldn't have done most of those things, and I just wasn't. You don't think about it at the time either, because you've been rolling around in the propaganda and not really giving it a second thought, or maybe you just didn't, it was your way of getting out of small town USA, and it didn't occur to you. So, can you kind of give us an idea of like what Masha was going through?
Yeah. So Masha is a self-proclaimed compartmentalizer, and she, like I think a lot of people, was traumatized by terrorist attacks in the early 2000s. And in my case, it's the fictionalized one that blows up the Bay Bridge. But if you read Snowden's memoir, he talks about having a comparable experience after the 9/11 attacks. And she's just filled with this kind of like atavistic rage, and also this very, I think, relatable adolescent desire to make a difference. And she realizes that she can. She's a lot smarter about computers than the DHS. that is I think not particularly fictional. The DHS, buys in a lot of its technology from Beltway bandit grifters, and it, barely works. And this is the thing we keep hearing about, like the NSO group and Palantir, is that not only is their stuff really evil, but it's kind of minor saving grace is it's also really terrible. Although, it's like good enough to recommend someone to kidnap and tape electrodes to their genitals. It's just maybe not the person that, the dictator who bought it would like in a game theoretically optimal world would attach electrodes to the genitals of. But it's so she kind of looks at this stuff and she's like, I can write better code than this, I can do better UI than this, and she talks her way into a job. She doxes the woman who's running the local station, who's the villain of the first two books, this woman, Carrie Johnstone, figures out how to ingratiate herself to her and gets a job. And she's taken with Carrie Johnstone to a forward operations base in Iraq as a contractor. And as contractors, they outperform all the other contractors because she's good at her actual job. And she knows that somewhere in the back office are people who have access to vulnerabilities that aren't widely known. And so she's doing all kinds of really badass data analysis, cascade analysis, where she's looking at communications like as a signals intelligence operative without knowing what's in the comms, but looking at the pattern where A talks to B and then B does something, and A talks to C and C does something, and A talks to D and D does something. So you assume that A is kind of the boss of B, C, and D. And, she finds ways to like validate her ground truth and so on. A lot of that came from a machine learning manual that Snowden provided that I reported out and published that MI5 used. So it's or MI6 rather. So it's grounded in actual like tradecraft and the way that they operate. And it's pretty rudimentary stuff by like industrial standards, but at the time it was very big military stuff. And she kind of tells herself that she's on the side of the good guys. And especially when she starts getting these 0 days to break into the phones of the militias she's tracking down. And they turn out to be doing revenge executions of Baathists and raping and murdering their wives and daughters, and she feels like she's really on the wrong side. But then she starts to see the collateral damage from that and ends up jumping ship for a rival, and she lands in the former Soviet Union building really similar tools, surveillance appliances to go in national data centers on behalf of dictators, sort of loosely modeled on the Belarusian dictator and the former Yugoslavian or former Ukrainian dictator, and so on. And she, at this point, is like, well, I've got to do something about my conscience. And she somehow talks herself into thinking that, on the one hand, like, a man's got to eat. This is just a job. If these guys don't have better OPSEC than this, they're going to get nabbed by someone else. So why not make it her? And on the other hand, she does what she did to get her first job. She doxes them, ingratiates herself to them, and then appoints herself their like OPSEC armorer and teaches them how to defeat the surveillance measures that she installs all day. And this is the kind of thing where if you are using compartments to talk yourself into doing stuff that you know is wrong, you end up taking on these very self-destructive tasks, at least in my experience. And she drives herself to this point where she reaches a crisis with her boss, another woman that she's gone to work for, a woman she calls Ilza She-Wolf of the SS, who's a retired DDR intelligence colonel who's moved into the private sector. And she ends up having to flee more or less for her life and lands back in San Francisco, where she learns that the cyber weapons that she spent her life developing are now being turned on her best friend and her best friend's protest group, which is a successor to Black Lives Matter. And that's where she really has to confront what's going on in her life.
So I guess, my biggest question here, just with technology, to start getting into the questions about technology and how we use it, do you feel like there's any kind of governmental usage of technology that isn't going to turn out to be some kind of evil, like whether or not they believe it themselves? She's working for, the United States, and okay, this is shit, I'm going to jump over to these guys, and it's a completely different, it's a completely different brand of dictator. Maybe they got there differently, but they're doing the same kind of thing. And then in the end, oh shit, everything I've done is being used against me and my friends. Is is there any kind of good usage of technology from a government that we can trust?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that the Little Brother and Homeland books did was really inspired a bunch of technologists to get into the field. It's maybe like the thing I'm most proud of in my life, apart from fatherhood, is the number of people who've come up to me and said, like, I'm a cyber lawyer, I'm a cryptographer, I'm a security tools developer, I'm a software developer, and the reason I'm doing that is I read Little Brother and Homeland. And Snowden, actually, if you watch the documentary Citizen 4, he's got a copy of Homeland with him when he flees his hotel in Hong Kong. It was pretty heartwarming to see that. So what I'm hoping with this book is that it will create some like early onset Oppenheimers, that there are a lot of people who are developing this technology, either for private contractors who will sell it to governments or directly in the government. And, Oppenheimer afterwards really regretted what he did. He got kicked out of the president's office because he said, "I've got blood on my hands, Mr. President." The president said, like, "Don't let that son of a bitch back in the White House ever again," when he was called in for a meeting to congratulate him for his work on the atomic bomb. And, kudos to Oppenheimer for developing a conscience. Wouldn't it have been great if he'd done it before he started quoting the Bhagavad Gita as the first atom bomb exploded behind him? And I think that if you can convince people to consider the moral dimension in their work, they can infuse the things that they do with some ethical character. I mean, you ask whether governments can use technology wisely. I mean, the answer to that is like, obviously, yes. And the proof is that we're not all dead of Giardia or Listeria. And, the reason for that is a bunch of intensely technological processes, and not just intensely technological processes, but processes that A, can be weaponized, and B, no one in government understands, right? Like, it's not like we elect microbiologists or epidemiologists. We elect people who are capable of evaluating evidence-based policy and acting on it, or at least we have sometimes. My roof hasn't fallen in on me.
We try
to, right? And so the question is like, not can they use it wisely, but what are the social factors that cause technology or policy in general to reflect kind of pluralistic values that lift all of us up? And what are the ones that cause it to either go wrong, just to make mistakes, or to be deliberately wrong? I've been following these FinCEN leaks that just came out over the weekend. And, it's pretty clear that like the financial regulators had information that $2 trillion had been laundered by criminals, and it was there in black and white, and they just did nothing on it. So what is it that leads to not just like errors, but malpractice? And I think that's mostly about power and the how many hands it rests in, and when power is widely diffused, the equilibrium we come to tends to reflect the interests of everyone in whose hands the power has been diffused. And when power is very concentrated, it tends to get a lot more parochial, and we do stuff because it makes a rich person richer, not because it averts some terrible outcome.
Yeah, I mean, we did just have the president say, when you have the Senate, you can basically do anything that you want, and we're discovering that it is about power. Like technology by itself, it's inert. It doesn't have a want. It's not trying to do anything. It's when somebody picks it up and does something with it to influence or to push or to pull or something. That's where our biggest problems come.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the defining question about technology is not what it does, but who it does it for and who it does it to. What it does is ultimately kind of secondary to all of those questions.
Yeah. Now, I was going to say, you're a big proponent of open source everything. Which one thing that I saw that you are doing your attack surface is going to have an audiobook that's not on Audible because of DRM. Wherein does DRM become a problem with this? Why shouldn't I have rights to the thing that I created?
Yeah, so DRM is an interesting social and technical phenomenon. We talk about DRM, and for listeners who don't know, very briefly, DRM is like a lock in a technological tool you buy that tries to control how you use it. And as you say, people who create things sometimes say they should have the right to determine how it's used. But DRM functions irrespective of the legitimacy of how people want to constrain the use of something. More important than DRM itself, which ultimately is pretty easy to break for the most part, because DRM ultimately only works by hiding cryptographic secrets in equipment that you give to the people who you don't want to learn those secrets. And there's a technical term for, giving cryptographic secrets to your adversary, and it's wishful thinking, right? We don't keep even really good bank safes in bank robbers' living rooms. And if you give someone a device that has cryptographic secrets in it, they'll eventually figure out what those secrets are. But what it has is a law. In fact, it has a variety of laws around the world. Section 1201 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act that Clinton signed into law in 1998 makes it a felony punishable by a 5-year prison sentence and a $500,000 fine to remove DRM, provide a tool to remove DRM, or explain how DRM can be removed. And it is not tied to copyright infringement. So although DRM is characterized as a copyright protection measure, removing DRM, even if no copyright infringement takes place, is itself a violation of the statute, which is how you get stuff like Apple using DRM to lock you into its app store, right? If I make an app, like if I make, Fortnite, and you want to run the app on your iPhone, I made the app. It is my copyrighted work. You own the iPhone. It is your property. But for you to buy my copyrighted work for me and enjoy it on your computer is a felony if Apple doesn't permit it. And so what this amounts to is a kind of felony contempt of business model, right? Anyone who designs a device so that using it in a way that displeases the shareholders involves breaking DRM makes displeasing the shareholders a felony because it involves breaking DRM, and breaking DRM is a felony. And that's what they use to stop you from fixing your John Deere tractor or your Medtronic ventilator. It's what they use to stop you from connecting your Abbott Labs continuous glucose monitor to a third-party insulin pump so that you can control your diabetes. It's this technology that allows shareholders to project their will over the people who buy the products of the companies that make them. And it's not particularly good at protecting authors' rights, because the person who controls the DRM and who can authorize its removal is not the copyright holder, it's the DRM company. And so if I get pissed off with Amazon and leave Audible, say I've sold all my audiobooks on Audible for a decade and I leave Audible, you can't follow me to Amazon's rival, to maybe a little upstart like Libro.fm, or even a big rival like Google Play, without Amazon's permission. Your books remain locked to Amazon's platform forever, right? Even beyond the term of copyright. Like if I drop dead today, my stuff enters the public domain in 70 years. My daughter will be 82 then. And she can't, not only can she not authorize you as my copyright inheritor to remove the DRM from my audiobooks and leave Amazon's silo, but even afterwards, even after I've been dead for 70 years, because removing the DRM would implicate other copyrighted works that are still in copyright, no one can authorize you to remove the DRM except Amazon. And that's just obviously not good in a monopolistic market, or more importantly, a monopsonistic market, a market where you have one company that has all this buyer power that gets to control who can enter the marketplace the way Amazon does. If every time someone buys one of my audiobooks, that $12 or $20 they spend is $20 they have to forfeit to leave Amazon. Every time I sell a book through Amazon's platform with its DRM, I give it more negotiating power over me. And anyone who's been paying attention to Amazon and the way it relates to its suppliers knows that in the long term, that is not going to be good for me. Amazon has no scruple about putting the screws to its suppliers.
As an aside, really quickly, Cory, you might get a laugh out of this. I may have purchased the one consumer electronics device that not only does not have planned obsolescence, but may actually have increased in value. I have a Brother wireless printer, but it's the last model of this printer that was made without a generic toner cartridge defeat chip. And so as a result, it is worth more than it was when I purchased it in 2011. So I just remember
That's
thinking
wild.
about that kind of thing, that how that extends not just to tractors and medical devices, but also literally to like your home printer. But I wanted to switch gears.
Yeah, don't update your firmware.
Yeah, I will not. I absolutely will not.
But then also only connect to it over a wire, because a wireless device that you're not updating the firmware on is a point of entry to your network.
Man.
So turn off the wireless, get a USB cable, and never update your firmware.
Yeah, there it is.
Yeah, don't worry, Corey. We're gonna get deep into some security stuff soon.
Yeah.
So the one question I wanted to ask you is more one just sort of about like what I would describe as maybe the perspective of your work. I don't know if you would consider this fair, but my familiarity with your work extends to the things that I've read from this book and then some of your earlier stuff. And I guess to me, it's like I feel as though there's what I might call like grim optimism, and I feel as though, all right, in this present moment, Francis and I are military veterans, and we're seeing a lot of stuff what you might describe as come home, in the sense that things that concerned us, or maybe just that we only marginally noticed when deployed, we're now seeing brought back to America and visited upon Americans for daring to protest. And at the same time, like, it's very easy to become incredibly nihilistic about it and just assume that everything is a loss. But I also have seen I've seen more veteran activism, for good, in my opinion, than I've seen at any other time in my lifetime. And so there's a certain degree to which I remain optimistic, even if the situation is obviously extremely bad. And I wonder, as I understand it, when you record with Trash Future, you said you lived in Burbank, yeah?
Yeah. Lockheed territory.
I was just saying, and I reckon you're probably dealing with the smoke from the fires and things like that.
Oh, yeah.
And in a sense, I was thinking, like, in watching everything going on around you, you are, obviously bearing witness to an incredibly bad situation. But it strikes me that in your work, you have the belief that there's an extent to which the systems can be repurposed, or the operators of the systems can achieve a kind of, like, I don't know, ethical sentience, if you will. And I'm not trying to put you on trial here. I'm just wondering, like, how do you think through that process, in the sense, like, holding on to that? Because it's hard for me sometimes when I think about it, when I'm like, well, for every one leftist veteran who's anti-war and anti-imperialism I meet, there's like 300 who are just actually cops now. Like, so it's hard to maintain that optimism all the time. And I wonder, like, what is that like for you as a writer, given not just what you write, but also your subject matter expertise?
What the hell are you smoking, Corey?
Yeah, I'm nothing, because it's a federal crime and I'm here on a green card. So, look, let's dispense first of all with optimism and pessimism, which are both forms of like fatalism, right? They're the belief that things will get better or worse irrespective of the action we take. And I like the thing that I think you're identifying in my belief system is the belief that what we do matters. And so that is antithetical to optimism or pessimism, right? I believe in human agency. And like, do you want the long answer or the medium answer?
I'll take the long answer. I mean, it's fascinating so far.
Okay. So let me tell you about my friend Aydah Palmer, who's this brilliant science fiction writer and librettist and singer, but who's also a tenured Renaissance history professor at the University of Chicago. And she is famous there for doing this annual LARP where they reenact the election of the Medici's Pope. And so she gives each of her students a role to play from the actual Renaissance Florence moment at which the Medici's Pope was being elected. They spend weeks like in skullduggery, forming alliances, making betrayals. On the last day, she's got this Google alert for theater troupes that are getting rid of their costumes, and she dresses them all in Renaissance Italian costumes, and they invest the new Pope. And the final four every year contains two people who are the same, and two people who are never the same. Because while there are great forces of history bearing down on that moment that determine half of the final candidates, half of the possible final outcomes, human agency defines half of the outcomes as well. And really, like those great forces of history that we're talking about, they're just like the echoes of human agency in earlier iterations of the game. So stuff happens because people do stuff, not because we are destiny's prisoners. And so for me, like, the question isn't, will things be better or worse? The question is, what path is it that maximizes the outcomes that I want, right? And that's hope. It's not optimism. Hope is like the belief in a necessary but insufficient stepwise traversal of an unknowably complex terrain towards a better outcome, where you look around and you see what you could do in this moment to make things better, and you take the step that you think will get you closest to where you want to go, even if you can't see what your next step will be, in the expectation that when you attain a new perch on higher terrain, that new paths will be revealed to you that you can take. And I think that, that's the difference between a novel and real life, is in a novel, I can plot a course from A to Z. But in real life, the terrain isn't just unknowably complex, it's adverse, right? Because there are other actors on the terrain who want a different outcome, who are rearranging the terrain as we go. And if the first casualty of any battle is the plan of attack, then by the time you'd figured out your path from A to Z, it would be obsolete. So all you can do is follow this heuristic. And so that's the optimism I have. It's hopefulness, right? The belief that if we can see at least one thing we can do to better our situation, that we should do it, because we don't know where we will get to from there. And as to like human decision making and the crisis that we're in now, I talked before about sanitation. Like, we are the living proof that as a species, we can come together in very big, ambitious, technologically complex projects with very high stakes, where there are parochial interests that cut against the best possible outcome, and still emerge, right? Still emerge with buildings that don't fall down, still emerge with, sanitation systems that don't kill us all 100 times over. My grandmother, like the only Polish she taught me was the all-purpose Polish swear word cholera, which means cholera, which is like the all-purpose swear word because getting cholera is so awful, right? We just kind of forget this stuff, right? We forget how many of these like deep societal woes we have actually overcome. And so we're not like the ignorant rump of a fallen civilization that has forgotten how to come together. We are like everyday mediocrities, no better and no worse than our ancestors, right? It's not like we're living through the Renaissance where we're like, the Greeks and the Romans knew how to fly, and they could also go to the moon, and they could make, horses out of clay, and then they would come to life, and we just have to figure out how to do what they did. Like, we know what our ancestors did. We know that they were a mixed bag. We know that a lot of them were fucking terrible and did terrible things, but they also did amazing things collectively, and so can we. And, you talk about the military and leftists in the military. I grew up in the anti-nuclear proliferation movement. My grandparents were Red Army deserters. So, I've got like a military background. And I've met so many people from the military who bring some of the values from the military, solidarity and self-discipline and kind of realism to the struggle that's incredibly beneficial to the shape of the movement. And one of the weird things about writing a book about insurgent warfare, which like Little Brother and Homeland were, and which Attack Surface is I get invited to places like West Point Cyber Institute to give lectures, and like the Air Force Academy. And I've met tons of those people, like the elites, right? The people who get through ROTC, even the dumbasses who pay their way in through the Citadel. And like, you can see in them a mixture of values, right? They are flawed vessels like the rest of us, and depending on the social conditions around them, some of their upbringing will be upregulated or downregulated. And so our challenge is to figure out how to build structures that brings out the best in people.
Yeah, I guess the biggest thing is you need to worry more about your morality, and whether, as long as what you're doing is it beneficial, not to just to me, but to everybody around me. Is this a way to fix things? And unfortunately, of course, not everybody has the same morality. So some people are like, yes, it is, because I'm putting these brown people in these cages, and then we send them back to their country that we're bombing. But still, they still think that they're doing the right thing. So kudos to them. It's just what you want to do is incredibly fascist and terrible.
Well, and they get there one step at a time. That's the other thing. Both this book and my book, Walk Away, really get into this idea that the way that you end up putting a kid in a cage is not by waking up one morning and deciding to do it. It's by taking one little compromise and then evaluating the next compromise that life demands of you, not relative to where you were before the first compromise, but where you are now. Like, is this only a little worse? Like, a little worse is okay. And so if a little worse on top of a little worse, on top of a little worse, on top of a little worse, eventually adds up to the regret that you have on your deathbed when you realize that you spent your career putting kids in cages. And again, like, it's back to this idea of early onset Oppenheimerism. Like, can we get people to have that moral awakening earlier? And what do we tell them when they do, right? Like, because part of this book is about how the protagonist Masha's friends and former friends relate to her as she comes to grips with the moral character of her own career, and what they do to allow her to rehabilitate herself, to think more clearly, and then use the lessons that she's had, those hard-won lessons about the moral consequences of allowing those little compromises to snowball, to serve as an example to change others. Because I think, like, I'm no Werner von Braun fan or anything, but like, the idea that we never rehabilitate people is itself a guarantee that people will not seek rehabilitation.
Yeah, that's Nate and I have often been yelled at for being politically on the left while also being veterans. And even though, you speak out against the military and against the wars, it doesn't matter. You still are a military veteran in the eyes of some people. And it's like, you have to have that grace for rehabilitation. Like, I will always keep, when I meet troops that are, hard right and, or cops or anything like that, there's ways you can still talk to those people. There's ways that you can still rehabilitate those people, even if it's to, come a little bit over to your side. And without that, without trying or without believing that, yes, people can be rehabilitated, I mean, you're basically othering them, which is exactly what the other side does to you, and it turns them away from they're no longer a person. They are simply my enemy. And as a soldier, I understand doing that because it makes it really easy to kill somebody who you don't see as a person. But altogether, though, that's incredibly terrible, and you shouldn't do it.
Well, and the only tragedy worse than like the terrible things that you do when you talk yourself into doing them is never learning from them and never using that hard-won knowledge, all that blood and treasure you spilled, to try and prevent it from happening again.
But yeah, and I think one of the things that I would point out too is, I mean, I might take a harsher view than Francis because I think that I'm somewhat more distrustful of the self-regulatory mechanisms of systems and of organizations, and I think the reason for that is not like there was any one grand failure that I experienced, but I just saw in the military the extent to which it felt as though the ultimate job is to make sure that the organization doesn't look bad. And as a result, that creates a situation in which there are lots and lots of compromises being made. But then there's also, it creates a situation where that focus becomes so, monomaniacal to the point that ethical concerns don't even enter into people's minds. It's just, hey, I'll give you an example. Years ago, when I was still in, I was attending a school at Fort Benning, and one of my old commanders was there. And I thought he wasn't a particularly social guy, but he was absolutely like good at the things you're supposed to be good at as a commander. I mean, his soldiers mostly hated him because he wouldn't let them go on like cool guy missions, but he said, hey, listen, we're in Afghanistan. Our job is to train this Afghan unit that we're working with. That's all we're going to do. There's no need. If you want to go and play whack-a-mole and fight insurgents, it's like, well, if they want to come attack us, then great, we'll fight back. But we're not going to go like trooping through the mountains in a place where we don't have a permanent presence. That's just a waste of time. And so I kind of respected that his view was very pragmatic. And I mean, he was really strict about not slipping up on the little things. But he just ethically, like, that's the weird thing. You hear that, you're like, hey, this guy seems to have his shit together. He knows what he's talking about. He seems to be like a good commander. But the angriest I think I ever saw him get outside of like your soldier got a DUI kind of thing was when I told him that I was trying to figure out how to wire money to somebody in Afghanistan I knew, because there were some kids who lived on their dad worked on our compound, and their dad got killed by the Taliban, and the family was destitute. He was the only provider. And I was like, well, fuck, I'm going to send them like $1,000 because, that's money. That's a huge amount of money to an Afghan family. And like, I mean, I thought of them as my friends. Like, I want to, and he was just like, why would you do that? Like, those people need to figure it out for themselves. And I was like, dude, they have 6 kids under the age of 18. Like, what do you think they're going to do? And he's like, well, they could just be shy boys. by which he means they could be the sex slaves of Afghan military commanders. And I was just like, are you really telling me that you think it's that bad of an idea for me to send money that you'd be like, oh, child sex slavery is better than you, what's the right word here? Spoiling the natural balance of things? You know what I mean? And like,
right, the moral hazard.
Yeah, because they might become dependent. They might become dependent on a
everyone will kill their father if they get $1,000 from a GI when they do it.
And I mean, I said the fucking money. It's not easy to wire money to Afghanistan, but the thing about it is just like, the reason I bring that up is not like the shock value. It's more to say that like, here's somebody who is in the eyes of the system incredibly proficient at what he does, and not like I'm a killing machine proficient, but like he meets all these criteria of like somebody who cares about the things in a way that might be unpopular, but accomplishes what the organization says it wants to do. But then when put to a challenge like that, comes up with an argument or a notion or a position that to me just seems not only so devoid of empathy that it's like I'm almost embarrassed to have heard those words spoken aloud. And so to me, that's like, I think where that fear of organizations and that fear of the idea that I mean, like Francis was saying, not to other people and not to say, this person is my eternal enemy. But I do think that when you look at things that are uniformly violent and reactionary, that the organization is my enemy and the people need to leave the organization is basically my view. And so, like I said, we're not putting you on trial. Yeah. It's just more that like, no, it's a hard square to circle to square, however you would say that. It's a hard notion to get around for me.
But I mean, I reflecting on, and I don't know your own journey to how you got to where you are today, but the same factors that acted on you will act on some plurality of the people you served with and the people who serve after you, and like figuring out how to use your hard-won knowledge to reach those people, organize those people. And this is why if you ever read like a union organizing conversation script, that it emphasizes drawing on your own personal experience and particularly on your experience before you figured out which side of that fight you were on.
That makes sense. I mean, that's a lot of stuff that we try to do, honestly. I know Francis has a bunch of questions he wants to ask, so I'll let him go on. But I will say this, that like that is one of the rewards, I think, or one of the sort of rare, I don't know, like moments of zen, if you will, about doing this show, is that we often do get people who are either vets or who are still in, and they reach out to us and say like, I'm thinking the same way you guys are talking. It's just that you're the only other person I've ever heard say it out loud. And so that's kind of why we do it, is because like I do think that there are lots of people who are reachable. It's just, to me at least, while still in uniform, and certainly if somebody is, in something like the police or DHS or something like that, I feel as though the kind of uniformity of the organization makes it very, very hard to act any other way besides the way the most regressive or negative way that organization acts. And so, I mean, it is like, it's kind of a point of debate, I suppose, but
that's what I mean when I say like, what structures can we build that upregulate the things about human conduct? I don't like the term human nature, but at least human conduct that produce like socially beneficial outcomes, and what can we do to downregulate the ones that produce socially negative ones? If you listen to like histories of Chinese families that grew up during the Cultural Revolution and what they call report culture of denunciations, and the legacy of low trust that produced and the bad outcomes that produced, like you can see how you can build a set of social structures that will upregulate bad, negative, like socially non-optimal outcomes. But then you look at other societies where they've structured things differently, and you see these really beneficial outcomes. And so like, I guess what I'm saying is like, yeah, those people might be doing bad things. They might have made bad choices, and they might be bad moral actors, but to focus on the individuals and their bad choices, as opposed to the systems that upregulated their worst impulses. I mean, the whole idea of like the unconscious bias critique is that we all have biases, we all make snap judgments, we all have prejudices, that being a good person in the world is not ridding yourself of bad instincts. It's recognizing them and heading them off.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Nate has the problem where he was in the infantry, so he was with all the ground pounders.
Yeah.
So he got to see that stuff. I was public affairs. I was with the writers and the photographers and the videographers. Right. So I was around all the intellectuals. So I'm like, oh, the soldiers, they're okay, they're fine. And Nate's like, they're all terrible. They're all terrible.
I never
and they're
said.
all racist.
I've never said that. That's just But I know. The extent to which the harshest and most like us versus them instincts come out when you're in a situation of, well, I mean, when you're in an impossible situation that also has a lot of danger involved. I mean, I don't blame people for becoming very binary and us versus them when they're in combat, because I think that's just human nature. But I also think that there's an extent to which a lot of those thought processes that develop in a situation like that then oftentimes are very fertile ground for people to become radicalized towards the right and towards authoritarianism. And the military is, in a lot of ways, an incredibly, I mean, it's probably like the definition of authoritarianism. Like basically,
in many ways, in all the ways.
All the ways, yeah. I mean, I had to stop myself when I'm saying that, but I mean, legitimately, because you think about it, you're like, it's so normal to us that we're like, oh yeah, the job that we have. And it's like, you mean the job that you have where like they can rip you out of your bed and scream at you for hours because someone in a different company got a DUI, but they're mad at you. Like
the job in which, like, if we were both still in, Nate could literally tell me to do anything and I would have to do it because it would be illegal if I didn't, because he was a captain and I'm a sergeant.
Right.
Yeah, something like that. Well,
so Cory, I wanted to ask you. I have a degree in network engineering, so I understood about 75% of the tech stuff that you had in your book. But this is a question that I always ask security people, especially people who are really into cybersecurity. Sometimes I get answers. If some of the real paranoid ones, I get a side eye and told that they're not going to tell me that. But in your house, what do you have connected to your internet?
Oh yeah, no, we have, speaking of attack surface, we have a big attack surface. And the reason we have a big attack surface is because I live in a non-authoritarian environment in which the other people I live with, namely my wife and my daughter, have to use devices that suit their needs. And so we're all on the same LAN. And that means that my daughter's phone, which runs TikTok because she's 12 and she lives in Southern California, is on. And my wife, who works for like a blue chip multinational company, has this super lockdown MacBook that she doesn't know what's in it, right? They've got their own kernel, and I'm sure it's full of crazy bossware, and I don't know what kind of network snooping it's doing. So I try to draw my perimeter around my device rather than around my network, because I just think as like a matter of, practicality, that's what it's got to be. And, the other thing is that when there isn't a plague on, I travel like 4 to 6 months a year. I'm changing the climate, ask me how. And so much of my networking is done in hotels, conference centers, airports, like environments where it's very easy for attackers to be on your same subnet. So I use a pretty locked down version of Ubuntu. So that's a flavor of Linux that's really easy to run. You just like download it to a thumb drive, stick it in. I buy old ThinkPad or new ThinkPads. Like when I quit smoking 15 years ago, my doctor said, you need a reason to quit smoking that's better than not getting cancer in 40 years, because you'll want a cigarette next week and then not getting cancer in 40 years won't feel good. I'm like, well, how about this? I spend 2 laptops a year on cigarettes. I'll just buy myself a laptop every year and congratulate myself for saving money. And he was like, that is a great one. So I buy a new ThinkPad every year, download the latest version of Ubuntu to a thumb drive, stick it in, click install. There are a bunch of networking options that are on by default that like lock stuff down a bunch. I primarily use Firefox and Brave as my browsers. I have all the ad block and all the tracker block turned on. I use Privacy Badger from the Electronic Frontier Foundation as my first line of defense, as well as things like HTTPS Everywhere. I use both Google Authenticator. So I have a Pixel running stock Android, which is a pretty secure operating system if your attacker isn't Google. And it's like, that's the choice I've made. I don't think it's like I don't think it's the right choice for everybody. And I don't know that it's the stable long-term right choice for me, but it's a good choice right now. And then on that, I use both Authenticator, which is Google's 2-factor tool, and Authy, which is a standalone one that in theory is much harder for an adversary who is inside of Google to use against you. And so depending on the service I use that. And then it's just, your basic like encrypted hard drive with a really good passphrase, and then an encrypted text file that also has a very good passphrase that has all of my passwords, and all of my passwords are 128 characters long and just generated by a random number generator so that, I could never type them. I just paste them in, and, things like Signal with disappearing messages for having sensitive conversations, Signal in general for all conversations so that there isn't like the signals intelligence analysis you can do where it's like, oh, look, he's talking about something sensitive, and now he's talking about something that's not sensitive. So, I migrated my family, for example, onto Signal instead of, we used to use WhatsApp, and I became a Zucker vegan. So I deleted all Facebook related products. Tell me when I'm rat holing too much.
No, this is all good. I'm making some notes too.
I'm taking notes. Yeah.
Yeah. Host, like just like the good old Etsy host file of like anytime, your computer tries to resolve any domain that belongs to Facebook, redirect it to 0000 so that it just doesn't ever resolve, is a really solid way to organize your data. And to keep Facebook from sneaking in, Facebook trackers from sneaking in, even if they're like in the SDK that built a mobile app when you're on your Wi-Fi. The problem, of course, is that if someone sends you a thing that's only on Facebook and you want to, pop up a private browser window and look at it, you can't. So it's a kind of self-limiting move, but it's a choice that I've made with a few, top-level domains from some of the worst privacy actors.
And safety are the most recent memes. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, well, it's not that though, right? It's stuff like, so I'm a member of a co-op in Canada called the Mountain Equipment Co-op that's like REI, except 12 years ago, it got taken over by MBAs who changed the bylaws so that they could veto any new board member who wanted to stand for nomination. And then 8 years ago, and then 8 years later, they canceled the AGM, secretly sold the co-op to a California private equity fund, paid themselves $1 million in retention bonuses, and kind of walked away. And now there's this big scandal because there's 5 million members who were never informed, never given a chance to vote on it. And all of that organizing is happening on Facebook. And like, I've signed the petition on change.org, but I'm also a journalist. I want to write about it, and I can't follow it because it's on Facebook, because I have to get another device to follow it, or change my host file and then remember to change it back, which is a lot of work.
So what kind of BitLocker code do you have on your refrigerator?
Yeah, no, I have dumb refrigerators. We have dumb appliances. We did this year buy some Sonos speakers, the ones that don't have microphones. And so they're on our LAN. They're like untrusted devices on our LAN. And what I should really do, like when things catch up, is segment the LAN. Like that's really the right answer, right? Is to draw like another perimeter around every device or every cluster of devices and stick all the untrusted devices on a different thing. Sometimes it's hard though, right? Like, because your phone is your interface to your Sonos devices, and it has to be on the same subnet to use it. You can't just log in over like TCP/IP. You need to use a LAN-based discovery tool. And so you can't change the music without switching your phone to the untrusted segment of your LAN. And this is the problem with your brother printer too, is there's this path dependency, right? Where like if this came up for the first time for me when Apple started removing features from iTunes back when I was an Apple user. I had an iPod, a first generation iPod, and I had iTunes. And they would add features to it, and they'd be like, okay, go buy some music because now you can do X, Y, and Z with them. And then 2 weeks later, they'd be like, we changed our mind. You can only do X and Y. Here's your update. And you could not install the update, but then you couldn't update your operating system. And now you're having to make a choice between updating your operating system and like installing anti-features for some device you want. And that path dependency is super hard. It's why it was so sketchy that HP started hiding downgrades in their security updates for their printers, where they were like really, it's the closest analogy is like pretending to be a vaccination worker in order to find Osama bin Laden and then making an entire region just not get vaccinated afterwards, right? Like it's when you train people that sometimes your printer security update stops bad actors from taking over your printer, snooping on all your documents, breaking into your laptop. And sometimes it just breaks your printer so that you can't use third-party ink. You discourage some like fraction of all the people who own printers from updating their printer, and then they become like a pool of like potential contagion and infection on the internet. Ransomware attacks get launched from them, and DOS attacks and so on. It's like such incredible malfeasance, and so like toxic to have done it, and they keep doing it, right? They the lesson they learned from the scandal the first time in 2015 was that it blew over. And so they continue to issue fake security updates that are actually downgrades.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, they get their updates on their phones and on their printers or whatever, internet connected devices that they have. And like, for 90% of people, it doesn't bother them. It's just like, whatever, I need the thing to print. I need the thing to go to Facebook. I just, make it do the thing, and that's fine. But then you have those 10% like us, where my computer or my printer has been telling me it needs a firmware update, and all I can think of is like, you work. What do you need a firmware update for?
Well, I'll tell you what they need it for, right?
Eventually,
it's malware.
Eventually it's going to come around, and I always do. I run them, and thankfully my printer, because that's the thing. I always concerned. Like one security guy told me, he's like, put nothing on your network. And if you have to use a printer, get a dot matrix and a gun. And that way, if the dot matrix ever starts acting funny, you just shoot it.
I was going to say, like, do you shoot like letters into the paper? Like, you need a really big magazine, and it's kind of low res. But
no, but I'll tell you, I'll get surprised when my wife prints something, because I work in my office.
Right.
And I work from home, and I have the printer next to me, and my wife will be printing something for our daughter or something else, and like the printer will just turn on, and I have an instant moment of like panic. Of like, what is this? What are you doing? I didn't tell you to do anything.
Oh my God, I've got to tell you this story. So when I was a college student, I took Arabic for 3 years, and I want to say my junior year, when I was in a more advanced Arabic class, I had homework, and it was literally like they had given us excerpts of like a newspaper article to read, and then a bunch of questions we had to fill out. And I didn't have a printer, or my printer wasn't working, but I knew that if you could log in remotely off campus to the university WAN, I guess, and I knew there was a library in the school at Indiana University of Health, Physical Education, and Recreation that was maybe like a 10-minute walk from my house. So I knew I could log in onto the WAN, and I could print it there and just go down to the library and pick it up. So I did that, and I got my stuff, went down, I walked down, and I came to the library. I went to go get it off the printer, and the guy at the desk was like, "Oh, thank fuck." And I was like, what? And he's like, I saw this Arabic shit coming out. And I was like, well, are we getting attacked? What? And I was like, you must be fucking joking.
Well, so I think it was 2013, I went to DEF CON, or not DEF CON, CCC, Chaos Communications Congress in Berlin. And this guy, Ang Kui, who's like this legendary security researcher, gave a talk called Print Me If You Can. So it turns out that HP printers of a certain vintage, the way that they updated their firmware was that you added a comment to a PostScript file that said, firmware starts here. And then when you sent that file to the printer, whatever came after that became the printer's firmware with no user action. And so he figured out that you could just like hide new operating systems for printers in files called like resume.doc. And when you printed the file, the printer got a firmware update. And so he designed a firmware update that like it wouldn't increment the version number. So the version number would remain the same. It would accept all future updates and increment the version number, but throw away the update. It would crawl your LAN looking for machines with known vulnerabilities and take them over and open a reverse shell to his machine. And it would scrape all of the print jobs you sent it for anything that looked like a social security number or a credit card and send him a copy of that file. And, and that was his like demo, right? That was his proof of concept in 100 lines of Perl. And so, like not updating your shit is a big deal. Yeah. And
but also that's an insane way to do a firmware update. Like you shouldn't need to update like, damn, they found like our wide open back door. Like this is the thing that pisses me off about tech people is that, in many ways they'll be brilliant and then they just assume everybody that's not them is stupid. And they're like, well, if we just, make it so that as soon as a printer sees firmware starts here, it'll go ahead and just start doing a firmware update. And like, and sure, maybe somebody isn't looking for that exact thing, but it's like hiding a door with like a bush. Like, sure, the bush is gonna stay there, but at some point in time, there's going to be a breeze or somebody's going to trip over it and they're going to go, oh, fuck, there's a door here. How about that?
Yeah, security through obscurity. Yeah, I mean, there's like, so you're right. You're identifying like one of the many problems that we have with security, right? So one is that like sometimes companies just do malfeasant things, lazy things, and assume that no one will ever call them on it, right? It's not just that they think no bad guy will find it. They also think that no good guy will find it. And one of the problems with DRM, to go back to DRM, is that if your device has DRM, then the security research you do probably involves removing the DRM to see what happens. And then publishing that research becomes a felony. And so it allows dominant firms that are building DRM into devices to like control their customers' conduct and to prevent their competitors from making competing interoperable products. It allows them to also control their critics. That if I want to come to you and tell you like your pacemaker has a vulnerability, which a bunch of implanted Medtronic pacemakers did, where they could be wirelessly updated, right? And so you could instruct pacemakers to deliver lethal shocks to people through their skin from a distance, that my ability to warn you of that becomes contingent on their forbearance. And they can put me in jail or threaten me with jail if they don't like the fact that I'm warning their customers that their customers have now been put to lethal risk. And so that's like one domain, right? Like they make stupid mistakes. Another one is that security is hard, right? Like as Bruce Schneier says, anyone can design a security system that works on someone stupider than them, but that doesn't mean that it works. It just means that like they can't think of a way of defeating it. And so the only way we have to evaluate whether security works is the same way we have to evaluate any scientific proposition, which is publication and adversarial peer review, because that's how you catch your own stupid mistakes. And, a really instructive example of this is this guy, Mudge Zacko, who helped start Loft Heavy Industries, which is a big security research organization, and then left and went to the NSA and worked in the Tailored Access Operations Group, who are the gadget makers, right? The exploit makers. And when Mudge was at TAO, he would get these calls like, we're going to have access to this building tomorrow. Here are the devices we know about that are there. We need to exploit one of them so that we can be resident in the network and try to exploit the other devices later. And what they would do is gather the known devices and they would look at the binaries. They'd look at the libraries for the devices and they would look for the telltales of libraries that the programmers had used that people normally made mistakes when they did them. And they would make a ranked list of the ones that were hardest to have secured based on the development methodologies used, the libraries used by the developers. And they would start there on the assumption that those ones probably had the mistake. And they would do it without like any kind of insight into whether the developers were good at their jobs or bad at their jobs. They would just start with the stuff that was harder to do well. And I had like a crazy realization about this last year when I was teaching a writing course where one of the students said, I've learned all these rules about writing, like show, don't tell, and, don't just use he said and she said, and don't use attribution verbs and so on. And yet I read books that I like, including, your books, my books, that commit these alleged sins. What is it that makes that not a sin? And I had this realization that they aren't sins. They're things that are easy to do wrong. And so if you're reading a book and it's not working and you're trying to figure out how to make it better, start with the things that are hard to get right and see whether those can be improved or swapped out for something easier. And you will often make improvements. And that's why it's entered our critical vocabulary, not because it's a rule where you have to master the basics to break the rules or whatever, like that kind of jazz adage, but rather that like doing this well is hard. If it's not working, try doing something easier.
I'm with that. I'm also very lazy, so that works out for me. I'm gonna have to go downstairs and take my washing machine off the wireless, though. My wife bought these. She bought washer and dryer, and wasn't buying them for the Wi-Fi. It just happened to come with Wi-Fi, and I was reading, and I was like, yeah, all right, I'll put this on the Wi-Fi, see what it does, and it does nothing. It just sends me a notification when the washing is done, or it's like, do you want to remote start it? It's like, I don't see a situation where I put clothes into the washing machine and then say, all right, I need this to start washing in an hour, where I can't just come down. I don't know, maybe I could be at work and be like, man, I need things to be freshly wet when I get home. I don't know. But yeah, there's a lot of weird things that are on your wireless now, and like with really unnecessary apps.
My wife is a retired professional gamer. Like before esports, she was on the British Quake team. And, she's like this, games person. She works in media. And when we bought a house in Burbank and renovated it, she wanted to get a giant TV. And my rule was no wireless networking. And the biggest TV that you can get with no wireless networking is a lot smaller than the TV that she wants. And every single time we watch a movie, she's like, I hate our TV. It's too small.
See, I've just got the Roku. I'm with you on that. I don't like the smart TVs, but I don't know. It seems like you're getting to a point where you can't get it regardless. So the best thing that you can hope to do is like what I did and just not set it up. Like, yeah, you see that wireless. I'm not giving you the code to that. So you can just look at it. And I'm going to plug a Roku in here, and I'm going to unplug it when I'm done using it.
You just got to hope that the discovery mode that it's in when you turn it on doesn't become exploitable by someone who's like just war driving for vulnerable devices. But, I want to close that out
Corey,
by
I'm going to get the screwdriver out and take the whole damn Wi-Fi antenna out.
Well, so this is the thing, right? Like to get back to this idea of like not what technology does, but who it does it for and who it does it to. Like 40 years of neoliberalism has created this regulatory environment in which doing a thing that used to be completely normal, which is making a thing that plugs into an existing thing, an inkjet cartridge that plugs into an existing printer, a terminal that plugs into your IBM mainframe, which like there were so many businesses that got started by making cheap accessories for IBM, that has become a felony, right? Like either you're violating the DMCA because you're breaking DRM, or you're violating the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act because you're violating the terms of service, or you're violating a patent, or you're violating a trade secret or whatever. And like, I don't think like markets solve all of our problems, but if there's an anti-feature in a device, like someone will make a thing that remediates it and offer to sell it to you. The way, when I was a kid growing up in Canada, we hadn't banned defeat devices for satellite receivers, and like telephone poles had tear off sheets that said like, do you want to get more channels from your satellite receiver? Tear off this thing, and some dude will come over and gimmick your satellite receiver. And under normal circumstances, the amoral nature of capitalism is such that like people will start businesses to serve those needs. And what we've ended up with is not a market economy, but like this oligarchic economy where it's this kind of new feudalism where the only property rights are vested in like artificial like colony organisms called limited liability companies that use us as like gut flora, and we're just tenants of these devices. We don't get to have the suite of property interests that markets are supposed to run on, and instead we're just bound by terms of service and technological countermeasures. And it's not merely that these are odious, and it's not merely that they're embedded in technology, but the weight of the state will come down on you like a ton of bricks if you try to bypass them.
Cory, thank you so much for coming on and talking tech with us and talking safety and security. It is, I work in IT. Like I said, I have a degree in network engineering, so it's good to stretch those legs every once in a while on the podcast.
Yeah. Meanwhile, I'm having my mind blown because I'm like, we have a Google Mesh, and I'm like, well, it has to turn the microphone switch off. Maybe I just use that. And I'm like, apparently that's not enough.
Yeah, we have a Google Nest that I will plug in to do Spotify in the house, and then when we're done with that, I unplug it. Like I don't. I mean, look, my network is probably safer than most, but not as safe as it could be. But eventually, you come down to usability. Like if it's just me, I could do all kinds of things. But when it comes to also my wife doesn't want to have to deal with my bullshit,
sure, and
my daughter doesn't want to have to deal with my bullshit later on. Then is when, and also my wife can probably bypass. My wife was like bypassing routers when she was logging on to Prodigy and shit back in the day. Right. So she knows her way around a Wi-Fi configuration as well. So yeah,
you're getting at this like core truth, which is that the thing that technology gives us is not security. It gives us a little bit of security that we can use to, organize when we have disfavored ideologies and so on, but it's not stable over the long term because eventually you'll make some stupid mistake. And this is a point that gets repeated a lot in attack surface that, for you to have good security, you have to make no mistakes. For your adversary to breach your security, they have to discover one mistake. And so the role of technology is not to like create this like permanent demimon, this like temporary autonomous zone that sits alongside of an illegitimate society where authority is exercised without any kind of account or rule of law. It's to give us a space in which we can organize a campaign to improve all that other stuff, because like no key length will stop someone from tying you to a chair and hitting you with a rubber hose until you tell them what your passphrase is. They call it rubber hose cryptanalysis, and the only countermeasure for it is democratic accountability.
Yeah.
Cory, when does your book come out? When does this book come out?
October the 13th.
October
I know
13th.
I'm keeping you guys. You got to go. But this is a subject I get warmed up to. I'm sorry.
No,
I get ranty.
Hey, I'll bring you back on, man. We'll keep doing this because
Anytime.
I saw you post the whole thing about the Alexa landlord thing, and
Oh Jesus Christ!
we could do a whole fucking episode on that one, and that just ends in all of us becoming Maoists.
Who's the leader of the cult of personality? MAOTSE-TUNG Mao Zedong Wushi.
Hey, my very first Cory Doctorow book was Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom that I read while going to Disney World for my first time. So,
excellent. That's great.
It all comes full circle. Cory, thank you so much. Get the book October 13th when that comes out. Attack Surface. Read all of Cory's other books. Follow him on Twitter. What's your Twitter handle?
It's Doctorow. And then I have a standalone website thing called Pluralistic that's you can get as a newsletter or a Twitter feed or a Tumblr feed or a Mastodon feed or on the web or as full text RSS. So pluralistic.net.
See, that's the other good thing about a tech person. They know all the places to put themselves out onto.
Mm-hmm.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much, and we'll talk to you next week.